Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the IndieZoNe. My name is Kathy. It appears that Mr. Kohberger's filings have all now been complete with respect to his various motions to suppress evidence and also his motion for a Franks hearing. We have to condition our statement with "it appears" because everything has been filed under seal, at least the relevant supporting information. Why Mr. Kohberger feels that the warrants that were issued with respect to searches of his person, of his apartment, of his car, of his family's home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, where he was the day of his arrest, as well as IgG DNA, these and other matters were subject of various motions to suppress that Mr. Kohberger previously filed in this case, leading to responses in opposition from the state of Idaho, and now replies responding to the responses in opposition. So just by way of background, the initiating paper is always a motion. A motion is an application for a court order. A response is where the other side has an opportunity to convince the judge not to sign that order, and here's why, judge. And then finally, the moving or the initiating party has the last word in the form of a reply. And what a reply is supposed to do is not to re-argue the entire motion once again, but simply to limit arguments, rebutting whatever is in the other side's response. So we have the initiating motion, i.e. for suppression of evidence, response and opposition from the state of Idaho, and then finally Mr. Kohberger's reply. With respect to all of the motions to suppress evidence that you've seen on the docket, that we've talked about in prior episodes of the IndieZoNe, the podcast, as well as here on YouTube, these matters have already been set aside for hearing. Oral argument on motions to suppress, as well as any motions to compel discovery, have been set aside for January 23rd, 2025. Judge Hippler has also set a second date of the 24th, if necessary. He qualified that by saying if necessary. So for certain at this point, unless there's a change, the hearings, oral argument on the motions to suppress, January 23rd, if necessary, going into the next day, starting at 9 a.m. And we can find this schedule both for the motions, response, and replies, as well as for oral argument in the October 9th, 2024 pretrial and trial order that Judge Hippler entered. What about the Franks hearing? As you are aware, Mr. Kohberger has also filed a motion for a Franks hearing. The difference between the motions to suppress and the motion for the Franks hearing is that the court has to make a decision whether or not to grant this hearing. So at this point, there is no motion for a Franks hearing that will be entertained at oral argument on the 23rd, and if necessary, going into the 24th of January. It's possible that it might be scheduled, particularly for the 24th, because that's the second day that Judge Hippler set aside. But at this stage of the proceedings, it's still up in the air as to whether or not Judge Hippler has found that Mr. Kohberger sustained his burden of proof. And he does have the burden of proving that there was some sort of a defect in whatever affidavit for a warrant that he feels rises to the level of the test that was announced in the matter styled as Jerome Frank's versus State of Delaware. We did a prior episode on the IndieZoNe here on YouTube, going over that case and addressing Mr. Kohberger's rather high burden of proof that he has to meet in order to even qualify for this hearing. You'll know that the court initially disregarded the first filing that Mr. Kohberger submitted. On the 22nd of November, Judge Hippler rendered a ruling saying that the filing itself, not the substance of the filing, but the filing itself, was inappropriate because it had attached to it thousands of pages of documents. The court stated in that order that he found many of those pages to be duplicate, and also that Mr. Kohberger had not pointed the court with sufficient specificity within the filing where on the record the information supporting his argument that he was entitled to this Franks hearing was. So he was given a second shot to get his filing in, which he did. Mr. Kohberger resubmitted on the 26th of November 2024. The state responded, and now the reply has been submitted by Mr. Kohberger. So at this point, it's a matter of waiting for two things. Number one, the schedule for oral argument on the 23rd that Judge Hippler will put out. And number two, an order whether or not he's going to allow for this Franks hearing. If he denies the motion, it's game over. If he does not deny the motion, if he grants the motion for the hearing, then the hearing will be set and there will be other burdens that Mr. Kohberger has to meet in order to have that motion granted, which we again went over in our prior episode of the IndieZoNe, where we covered the Franks Supreme Court matter and also Mr. Kohberger's burden of proof. This will now conclude this episode of the IndieZoNe here on YouTube. Thank you as always for joining us here today.